Hi, good evening everyone. Ang gagawin natin ngayon ay reviewin natin ng konti yung last session and then dadagdagan natin para maintindihan natin ano yung implications nito, ano ang ibig sabihin nito sa ating young adult ministries. At pagkatapos ng session nito, gusto ko talagang makinig sa inyo ng feedback para alam ko kung ano ang aking tatahakin na itutuloy, no, kung ano man, no, dito sa series ng young adult uh, webinar natin. So the title of this session is Young Adult Ministry Ecumenical Examples and Pastoral Approaches for the Christian Church. And like I said last session, this is really a synopsis of a dissertation. Now, next slide. Na ang title ay Methods, Models and Methods for Youth and Young Adult Ministry, Ecumenical Examples and Pastoral Approaches for the Christian Church. Okay? So, yung apat na models dito ay one, the biblical hermeneutic model, two, the servant leadership model, three, the liberation model, and the fourth is the Christian discipleship model. So, tingnan natin isa-isa. Okay, the biblical hermeneutic model, no, is a method that investigates and interprets the sacred scriptures to have meaning and purpose for young adult religious experience. So these biblical narratives, as alam natin to, are life stories, action stories, and the Bible informs, forms, and transforms the human consciousness. Sa ating mga Kristiyano talagang hindi mo naman, you can't do away with the Bible. It's central in our Christian life. Next slide. Okay. Therefore, the principle of the biblical hermeneutic model, no, informs, forms, and transforms the reader by private interpretation that has been shaped by culture, community, and tradition. Alam natin yon. Na our interpretation of the Bible is shaped by our culture, our community, and tradition. Let us recognize that also na ang ating interpretasyon sa Biblia ay ang factors ng kultura natin, ng komunidad natin at tradisyon natin ay yun na siya nag-shape sa ating interpretation of Scripture. So youth ministers and young adult ministers will have to adopt reading methods and Bible study strategies that allow biblical narratives to address young people's issues and concerns, as well as develop biblical spirituality and biblical literacy. Okay? Upang nakapundar sa Biblia ang pananampalataya ng ating mga young adults. Next slide, please. Ayan, the distinction of this model is interpreting the Bible for pastoral reflection and ministerial praxis. And the theological objectives are to deepen the knowledge base and appreciation of the scriptures, to empower the reading and studying of the Word of God as a living book, and to engage in biblical hermeneutic process. Naniniwala ako na kung ang mga young adults natin ay talagang malalim sila sa Biblia, ay sila ay magiging active na mga Kristiyano at membro ng ating iglesia. Okay, the pastoral distinction, next slide. The pastoral objectives as higher biblical literacy and comprehension, become inspired to read and engage in Bible discussions, and to overcome the experience of biblical complacency. Okay. Now let's go to the second model. That is the servant leadership model. The servant leadership is probably the most difficult to realize because most of its fruits will be seen after students graduate from high school and college and move on from youth and campus ministry setting. Servant leaderships can also be viewed as threatening because it implies that the one who serves the most is the leader. No, by its very nature, servant leadership puts the subordinate first, the followers first, the employees first. Okay, next slide. The three backbones of servant leadership are listening, acceptance, and empathy. Parang pastoral care, actually, ang servant leadership model. Listening, acceptance, and empathy. The goal of servant leadership is to encourage and empower adolescents and young adults to become servant leaders within their home, school, community, neighborhood, and society, thus transforming their spheres of influence and the world. Ito, kung yung biblical hermeneutic model is more on the cognitive, the development of the mind, dito sa servant leadership model ang dinidevelop dito yung puso. It's the heart. The first model is more on developing the mind, a good grasp of the scriptures. But the second model is really more on developing the heart, yung puso, no, to listen, to accept, and to empathize. Okay, and therefore, uh, what's this? To strengthen the influence of young adults. Yan ang purpose ng second model. Okay, next slide. The distinction of this servant leadership model is learning the art of leadership through service and service learning. And the theological objectives is raise the consciousness about the theory and practice of servant leadership, teach the 10 characteristics of a servant leader, then develop an ethic of caring for individuals and community. Sabi ko nga, very pastoral ito, no? Yung, it's the development of caring, to, to develop young adults to become caring individuals. And then the next slide, the pastoral objectives is learn to choose service to lead through service. Okay, now leadership as a paradigm, service as a paradigm of leadership, and become empowered to be leaders within the society and become potential to be develop potentials through servant leadership. Okay, the next model is the liberation model. Of course, when you think about liberation, we always think about calling the Christian church to tolerance, compassion, justice, and peace. Okay, in the context of this book, the themes of enculturation, multiculturalism, and interreligious openness will be stressed as liberation topics. Okay, next slide. Liberation motives also takes as its primary concern the idea of emancipating oppressed peoples from unjust political and social subjection. Okay, so liberation is a theology of reflection and praxis that identifies with the gospel commitment of love, caring, and action. Liberation is born of shared vision to abolish unjust situations and to build a better society and humane world. So ang trust ng liberation, no, as a model of young adult ministry is for transformation, yung pagbabago ng lipunan, pagbabago ng komunidad, pagbabago ng mga sistema. So uh, it's more focused on justice, peace, and human rights. Okay, next slide. The distinction of the liberation model is focusing on the poor, the marginalized, the disenfranchised in society. Alam natin na mga young adults are already of that age na nandyan na sila, active sa komunidad, active sa lipunan, nasa workplace sila, may status na sila to be able to do something, to make a difference. So the theological objectives is encourage a theological practice to take shape within the ministry and establish pedagogy from the three areas that help to contextualize liberation theology. And the third is teach enculturation, multiculturalism, and interreligious openness. Dito yung very ecumenical, itong because it's our working together yung for the transformation of the world. Ito yung liberation model. Okay? Then the last one, the pastoral objectives pa pala. So to become attuned to the enculturation in their lives, encourage to appreciate cultural diversity, and learn to be open-minded to another religious persuasion. Okay, so that's very ecumenical. Okay, we go to the last model, and Christian discipleship model. Throughout the centuries, discipleship has been continuously affirmed and held in high esteem as being the predominant paradigm for devout and dedicated Christians. Sinasabi ko yan lagi na yung discipleship model, yun siguro ang number one na objective natin for the young adult ministry. And there are other Christian paradigms such as virginity, martyrdom, and monasticism, but discipleship appears to be the measuring stick for authentically committed Christians. So, totoo yan, that actually uh, discipleship is the norm for Christian life. Next slide. So, Christian discipleship, comes from the word disciple, alam natin yan. And this particular model examines 8 categories. No? Ito yung 8 categories that should be present in a Christian disciple. One, community. So imagine, number one ang community, yung pakikiisa sa mga tao. Pangalawa, conversion. Okay, we know that. 3 is faith. Pagkakaroon ng pananampalataya. 4 is leadership. Okay. 5th is morality, yung standards, no? And then 6 is prayer. 7 is service, and 8 is spirituality. So these are the categories that are present. Ito yung measuring stick ng discipleship. Those are the different aspects of being a disciple. Okay, next slide. The distinction of this is living as Christian disciple within a
Kahit
community
ka na rin dyan,
of faith. Theological objectives: 1, foster Christian adolescent conversion. Hopefully, before they are young adults, they already converted Christians or had a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. 2, teach about the 8 areas of Christian discipleship. And 3, empower behavior on the vertical, horizontal, and internal levels for Christian growth. Alam natin yung vertical, relationship with God. Yung horizontal, relationship with other people. And yung internal is relationship with yourself. Okay? And then the pastoral distinctive, next slide. Ayan. Develop a conscience and responsibility in living. Live as authentic Christian in the world, but not of the world, and faithful to God's call. That of course is our objective as Christian disciples. Uh, so that's why the discipleship model to me is still the most important model for young adult ministry. Now, let's go to the next slide. How do this work out? Paano ito maisasakatuparan sa isang programa, no, ng young adults? So this one just offers one example for each model. Magbibigay ng isang example paano ito ah, maisasagawa ang bawat model. Okay? So next slide po. Okay, in the biblical hermeneutical approach, one pedagogical method for implementation is to offer a monthly Bible study which consists of a 4-week series on various biblical themes. Okay, so the month of September could focus its discussion on God's creation. So week number 1, parang Bible study ito, no? Or Sunday school. The first, week 1, the creation story in Genesis, no, 1. And then week 2, the second creation story in Genesis 2. Then week 3, developing creation spirituality, which is in Ezekiel and Revelation. And week 4 is understanding ecology spirituality. Lalo na ngayon, no? Where the consciousness of ecological consciousness or nature consciousness is much part of our spirituality and part of our creation. So the biblical hermeneutical approach can take that, no? Bible study talaga ito. Okay, next slide. And then on the month of October, could concentrate its discussion on God's liberation and giving of the Decalogue, which will help reinforce in young adults their Judeo-Christian heritage. So yung week 1, the call of Moses, and then week 2, the plagues of Egypt, then week 3, the Exodus event, and then week 4, the covenant at Mount Sinai. No, ito yung ano. So of course you know this. No, this is the it is how God liberated the Israelites, and also from a Christian point of view, how God liberates us from our slavery to sin. So yeah. So from creation to freedom or liberation from bondage. Okay, the next slide. So each month, the biblical theme and studies rotate with different emphases, all focusing on the needs of the young adult population. The most important aspects of the biblical hermeneutic approach involves 4 steps. Okay? Of course, alam natin yon if we study the Bible. One is understanding the text. Two is making meaning out of the text interpretation. No? Parang observe, interpret, and then validate the correct interpretation through its fruitfulness. And fourth is appropriating the text for transformative understanding, or we call that application. Okay, these 4 steps will need to be part of the youth and young adult ministers scheme for developing biblical methodology, as well as creating a meaningful biblical curriculum for young adults. So the biblical hermeneutic approach, no, ang gusto niyang gawin, no, or ang dinidemand niya sa atin, no, ay magkaroon talaga ng Bible study curriculum for young adults. And uh, this is just example, no, an example of what we can do when we develop young adult ministry with this model, biblical hermeneutic model. Okay, let's go to the second approach, the servant leadership model. A second pastoral strategy for developing servant leadership among young adults would be to explore the life of a heroic servant leader such as Martin Luther King Jr. He was a magnificent servant leader not only in the south of the U.S. but internationally, receiving global recognition for his role in the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King Jr. exemplified all the qualities and traits that enable servant leadership to transform individuals, organizations, and societies. Next slide. King, like Gandhi before him and Jesus before him, strongly opposed violence and embraced passive resistance with agape, a deep love for all people, an overflowing and redemptive love which asks nothing in return. King proposed that rather than hating the oppressor, we love our oppressor because love is the key that unlocks the door which leads to ultimate reality. Such ideals of servant leadership merit exploration with young people, not just talk about it, but also studied and taught. Servant leadership pedagogy, such as adapting King's message into a curriculum, can easily be put into youth and young adult ministry practice. Okay, next slide. Here is one example of implementing King's work into a youth or young adult ministry gathering. Okay? One, plan an ecumenical evening of reflection. Such an event can be planned with neighboring churches on Martin Luther King Jr. Day. Okay? Second, the evening of reflection could integrate King's writings and key biblical passages that speak of hope and liberation. Read Martin Luther King Jr.'s letters in from a Birmingham jail to the students. You know what? My teacher in college in English 3, I believe was Christian because she required us to read this one letter or from Birmingham jail. So, have the students reflect on and react on the content of King's letter and watch a documentary or movie in the life on the life of Martin Luther King Jr. Movies such as Martin Luther King Jr. A historical perspective, and then debrief the movie and the evening in 20 minutes. So here's one example where you can develop a liberation model by looking at a person, a servant leader, who exemplified it. Next slide po. And then the task of the youth and young adult minister is to implement Martin Luther King Jr. or others who exemplify servant leadership and to excite, energize, and empower young people within the youth and young adult ministry to become servant leaders. Case studies are really very powerful, no? Na use for not only for youth who are, of course, your uh, they're looking at idols and ideals, hero worshiping, but also for young adults, for them to have an icon to follow. No? So this is the one way of implementing the servant leadership model. You can look at Mother Teresa, San Francisco of Assisi, or you can look at Ninoy Aquino, uh, things like some, okay, examples like that. Okay, next slide. Now we go to the liberation model. The liberation model is a third practical strategy to expose Christian young people to interreligious openness, multiculturalism, and tolerance. No? Yung libro, no, yung thesis na dissertation na to, ang in-example niya ay itong Islam. One approach is to examine and discuss Islam. A month-long emphasis uh, a month-long series on Islam could be designed like this. Week 1, the core teaching of Islam. There are 5 central teachings of Islam which can be discussed in general or at great length. The openness of God and humanity. 2, the prophethood and the completeness of Islam. 3, the human relationship. Uh, nako-cover yung aking video. the the human relationship to the divine and the unseen life, and the fourth, the unseen life, and fifth, the last judgment. So there are five central teachings of Islam. So on the second week, next slide, on week two, the five pillars, no, and jihad. There are five vital tenets of Islam that every Muslim should follow. A, belief and witness. Okay. Two, daily prayers. Okay. C, zakat or almsgiving or tithing. Fourth is fasting. Fifth is Hajj or the pilgrimage to Mecca. Jihad, commonly mistranslated as holy war, actually means striving. That is, striving for internal and external peace. Technically, jihad is not one of the five pillars of Islam, but it is an integral and daily part of Muslim life. So that's week two. Week three. Next slide. Week three is a cinema night on Islam. There are several movies and documentaries to choose from to help Christian young people learn about Islam. Here are a few: The Message, okay, Malcolm X, okay, Islam, Empire of Faith, and then Muslim, which examines the daily life of young American Muslim, and then Innocence of Muslims, portrays the increasing persecution and poor human rights of Muslims in modern-day Egypt. All five of these movies are acceptable for youth and young adults to watch and will help young people to understand religious diversity and tolerance. Okay, next slide. Week 4, field trip to a mosque. Visit a local Muslim mosque with the youth and young adult on a day that the Muslim community is not gathering for worship. This is a practical way to introduce Christian young adults to the worship life of Muslims. An imam or a Muslim minister can help the young adults understand the various developments of Muslim worship and symbolism within the mosque. A series on Islam is a wonderful way to expose young adults to the truth and misnomers regarding Islam. The series will also generate much discussion among young people. This series is a way to help Christian young adults to encounter other world religious traditions, contribute to interreligious dialogue, and experience firsthand interreligious openness. So the liberation model is really more on to liberate us from our biases, from our then um, sometimes we as Christians have all those barriers that we put up with other people. So this one, the liberation approach, is supposed to open us up, no? To become open, the openness or ecumenical in terms of our approaches, because especially young adults, no, they're into the working world, no, magkakatrabaho sila, pwedeng magkakaiba sila ng religious persuasion sa work, and so it's nice for them to be able to relate with one another, even if they differ from faith persuasions. Yung pagiging makatao, no? Yun yung inaano talaga na ang ng liberation approach, pagiging makatao at makadiyos. Okay. Next slide. Okay, strategy for the Christian discipleship model. A fourth applied strategy might loosely be following an academic calendar in which these 8 areas could be broken down into 4 parts, discussing 1/4 of each area once a month. Okay, ito yung sabi natin na 8, yung 8 aspects of discipleship. each month would represent a specific area within Christian discipleship. For example, September, no, very American to kasi September ang umpisa na. Ano. September introduces the students to Jesus of Nazareth. Okay? October addresses the conversion process. November studies the dynamics of faith. December investigates morality and ethical behavior. January examines the many facets of prayer. Okay. February explores the reality of community. March practices various types of Christian spirituality. April discovers service and social justice through hands-on experience. And May discusses styles of Christian leadership. So parang ito follows the academic calendar from September to May, no? Which is true in America. Nagiging true na rin sa atin dahil sa pandemic nito. Okay? May na ngayon ang last ending ng school year. But this is a good example of how discipleship uh, can be done. No? The 8 aspects of discipleship. Next slide. Another pastoral overture using the same strategy of implementation could be to discuss the 8 themes of discipleship in any particular order. Therefore, March might be the month to spend discussing morality issues with teenagers. For example, each week within the month of March, a different topic is explored. Okay, this is more. This is yung month na to, like for month, you discuss morality. The week 1 would be an overview of Christian morality. Week 2, the process of conscience and decision making. Week 3, morality and human sexuality. And week 4, human dignity and human rights. There are numerous possibilities for implementation and discussion. Limiting its area to 3 or 4 weeks allows for the youth and young adult minister to select different topics in the forthcoming years, ensuring that young people do not hear the same presentation each year. So you see, break down. No? This is an example. No? Yung una, month by month, ito yung theme. And then yung theme na yon, i-break down mo into week, per week for 4 weeks during the month. Okay? So next slide. Final remarks. These 4 models provide valuable theological content and pastoral context that will provide youth ministers and young adult ministers with resources that will empower them to faithfully and effectively minister to the needs and challenges that young people face today. In addition, these represent a relevant and sensible blueprint for youth pastors, campus ministers, and young adult ministers to build upon and to utilize as a practical guide. Moreover, the 4 models represented are merely theological organizing frameworks and modes of action that may become part of a minister's field of vision and sphere of influence to engage, enthuse, and empower young people to move beyond themselves. Finally, each model reflects certain aspects within culture and of course is conditioned as such. However, each model is timeless and each addresses the human consciousness and the great quest to become closer to God. Okay. Kung napapansin nyo, itong 4 models, 4 theological models ito, na are more ecumenical in nature, but they cover the 4 aspects of ministry with young adults. The first model, the biblical hermeneutic, is to develop our knowledge of Scripture, so it's more on the mind. The second model, the servant leadership model, is to develop our heart to be to be caring person. The third model, the liberation model, is supposed to break down the barriers that we have erected between young people, and therefore be free to engage in relationship in and break down even oppression and unjust systems. And of course, the discipleship model is to make us faithful Christians and disciples of Jesus Christ, which is really very necessary for young adults. So, with that, the next slide is thank you very much, and to God be the glory. That ends our session for tonight.